So playing by intent in Warhammer 40K, what does it mean and what does it not mean? Let's talk over a few of the more interesting grey areas. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be interesting to take a focused look at the whole idea of playing by intent, something that most of you out there have a pretty good grasp on, but doesn't tend to get brought up as a subject in and of itself quite as commonly. Playing by intent is something that's really quite common practice in 40k, often agreed on at the start of the game by a couple of players, and maybe kind of helpful for people who you don't know quite as well. A sort of general common agreement to have a slightly more relaxed and friendly game of Warhammer 40k, and try and actually have the generalship and commanding of models being the main factor in the course of the game, as opposed to very fine model positioning, sequencing errors, and trying to remember every gotcha rule under the sun. If I'd had to give a rough sort of definition of playing by intent, maybe something along the lines of talking about what you're trying to achieve and inviting your opponents to state if they don't agree that you can do that, and trying to make sure that everyone's essentially on the same page while you're playing games, and that both players are basically working together to try and make a fair game happen, and maybe focus a bit more as to trying to outwit their opponent in terms of gameplay and decision making, as opposed to having the game more determined by which people can do fewer things that get punished brutally by the 40k rules. I feel like it's perhaps best to illustrate with a bunch of examples as you're going along playing a unit, saying I'm deploying my units 9 inches away in as tight a formation as possible. So after that unit has arrived from reserve, both players should be on the same page that that charge will be a 9-inch one, unless the board state changes in any big way. Another common one might be, if I place my models here behind this terrain to try and hide for as much as possible, will your unit over there be able to shoot them or not? Clarifying board state positioning is like I'm placing one model just to toe onto the objective here, so that say if the table got knocked a bit and the model moves a small fraction, it's not going to cause disagreements. Or stating things like mission actions and things, my unit's going to be planning to drop here into this terrain in the reinforcement phase and do that action. Again, maybe giving you a bit of defense against just forgetting to deploy it. And it means that if for some reason you get one bit of the sequencing wrong as per the objective card, your opponent still knows the general intent. I feel quite often when people say that they're playing by intent, it often goes hand in hand with things like avoiding gotcha moments, surprise moves that the opponent might not reasonably have seen coming, things like reactive moves in 10th edition could be a good one, or anything unusual that can inflict damage in the enemy turn, maybe things like return fire mechanics, or big repositioning shenanigans. I feel like if you're playing by intent, you probably want to talk through at least a few of the more unusual faction-specific ones that might really catch people out at the start of the game, so both people know the options and what the units might do on the board. I'd also say it might go with people being a bit more friendly in terms of small sequencing errors and things. Like say if you maybe get to the shooting phase and fail to declare the start of an action on a unit that you previously said that you were going to, or a unit that was obviously in position to that weren't doing anything else, or maybe accidentally going onto your shooting phase and firing one unit when you haven't moved half your army. But all of this under the assumption that both players are mainly aiming to get a fair game going, as opposed to abusing any of these for some arcane advantage. I think it's usually at least fairly easy to tell if people are trying to do that blatantly. In general, I think that most people would pretty much agree that playing by intent is a pretty good thing for 40k. In general, it tends to be a game that's got really quite a big mental load and lots of things to get right if you want to go through a turn perfectly. Having to remember all the mission rules, special rules of the units, abilities of the opponent's units that don't have an official open source way to check them, and plenty of fine positioning things on the board. As mentioned, I think it's just nicer to focus on the actual gameplay as opposed to fine positioning a whole bunch of models that maybe don't really matter that much if your opponent knows the general idea, or things like springing traps through gotchas that can only really be done if your opponent lacks information that they should otherwise have access to. Beyond that, for the most part, it's just helpful to avoid disagreement. If you're both agreeing that a unit can do a certain thing before it does it, then it's better than having that discussion maybe in the next turn when one player thinks they can do something and the other thinks they can't. Could be helpful if things get knocked or bumped at all as you're playing. Maybe if terrain gets knocked over, if you know that all the unit was basically trying to hide from a certain gun unit and you'd agreed that that was the case, putting them back where they were might be a bit less contentious. It's maybe a bit less punishing if you don't know every single 40k rules interaction, if you're able to reasonably ask your opponent if they've got certain abilities, or say if they are able to attack your unit in any way. I think that all of that put together helps speed up the game a bit, maybe a bit easier to play relaxed if you're not constantly stressing about triggering some sort of gotcha move, or knowing their opponent's only going to raise objections to things when the action's actually done, if you have to commit to say moving your unit somewhere to be there. As a result, most of these things are fairly commonly done both in casual and in top tier competitive play, even if overall attitudes and what might be expected might differ a lot between players and different settings. Over the years though, I've certainly noticed a fair bunch of occasions where playing by intent has still sometimes led to disagreements. Often they're perfectly able to be resolved amicably in one way or the other, though it can often mean that one player winds up losing out a bit. One I've seen come up a few times is to say declaring that their unit is hiding behind this ruin and being out of line of sight, but then maybe not entirely stating exactly which units that it wants to be out of sight to, or whether that includes things like all the units' movement if they push up super aggressively fast, or have some sort of other mechanic like deep strike, reserves, or teleporting around the table. Say maybe a Tyrannid player says, I'm putting this Gene Stealer here and I'm aiming it to be out of line of sight to your army. In reality, probably the other player needs to come back with the question, yes, that's out of line of sight to my army now, but I could move this unit up here, or I could deep strike this unit down here. And if you're saying that with quite a lot of units, it might just put a lot of burden on your opponent to say all the other ways that they could move and think a fair way ahead, and maybe need to go a bit overboard with thinking about board states that haven't actually happened yet. If that sort of thing doesn't happen though, and the one player just says that they're hiding a unit and the other player vaguely agrees, but then moves up one of their units maximally so they do have a very good line of sight on the unit the way the opponent has positioned it, the first player might be kind of annoyed that they'd tried to hide their unit and the opponent had agreed that it had been hidden but then now has a line of sight on it and maybe asked to reposition their models so they were better hidden. Feels like in general with those sort of interactions you do need to really quite clearly specify what units you're intending to hide from, and does that include things like movement and deep strike and unusual stuff, as otherwise you get into a situation where it's basically just going to be the player who plays more politely and gives the opponent the benefit of the doubt in that situation. They might get an advantage. Another interesting one that I've seen come up with playing by intent are maybe more general purpose gotcha sort of things. I say perhaps some of the most obvious ones in 10th edition might be things like Overwatch or Heroic Intervention, stratagems that every army has access to, but still might not be in the forefront of everyone's mind literally all the time when they're moving or charging. Plus units in your opponent's army might have very different threats with those that might not be 100% clear for the people playing against them. On the one hand, you definitely could argue that everyone knows them, so if you fall foul of them, then it's basically your own fault. Plus, if players literally always remind them whenever you've got an opportunity to heroic intervene or overwatch, those stratagems will kind of rarely be used. There is still definitely good value in denying your opponent certain board positions and things, though often perhaps less impact than the actual damage a unit might do. On the other hand though, all the information might not necessarily always be there. Say for example, if you've got scary Overwatch units but your opponent doesn't really know the ranges of them or the severity of their firepower, that could still certainly come as a surprise when an Overwatch unit just deletes an enemy one. And occasionally you might have confusion with heroic intervention type things as well. Maybe if you charge a unit out in the open and the unit heroically intervenes you from behind terrain and you couldn't really see the exact position of the models before you made the charge move, for example. Even if people have just literally forgotten then there wasn't really any major excuse for it though, it can still feel like a bit of a gotcha move and a big punishment of a misplay that you otherwise might really not have done. And that can still be a bit feels bad, particularly if it's something that's so important that might determine the entire outcome of the game just because you got a squad heroic intervened or overwatched at the wrong time. It does seem that people have really quite different takes on this. You could warn people that you could overwatch either when you're moving, or maybe just highlight that one unit is a super scary Overwatch unit at the start of the game, and then just not give any warnings since. You could be a bit cryptic and say, are you sure you want to move the models there? And leave it up to your opponent to decide whether or not you're thinking about overwatching or something. Or you could just declare it and be lenient and allow some takebacks if your opponent asks for them, but put the burden on them to actually ask you to do so. Again, in that kind of case though, it sort of feels again that you'll be punishing the more polite players who just own the mistake and take it as their error, and rewarding people who are trying to get out of a mistake that they probably should have known about. The attitude could definitely vary a lot game to game as well, maybe casual versus competitive. Certainly at higher levels of tournaments and things, you sort of expect that people have a rough idea of what sort of units threat ranges are, and making sure that their units don't get heroic intervened and overwatched unexpectedly. And maybe do a bit of checking intent and say I'm moving the unit here. If I put them there, I believe that you can't overwatch me, and the opponent can confirm or deny. Otherwise, beyond grey areas like that, where I feel like there genuinely might be a bit of debate between two reasonable people as to how they treat a situation, I feel like abusing the opponent's trust by playing by intent can basically be its own category of poor sportsmanship and borderline cheating if you're clearly trying to lay the groundwork for that and then don't play very fairly in game. Maybe one of the most obvious things could be not being reciprocal, so taking a whole bunch of opponent generosity but not giving it back when it's important. In Warhammer games you might certainly have several different situations come up which might have a different sort of debate as to the rules or what models can and can't do. But in general, it's not going to help any sort of fairness if both players agree to play by intent, and then one player is just super generous to the other, and the other player doesn't really let them get away with anything. I guess that's just really common sense. It also wouldn't really work too well if players aren't really doing good communication. Say one player asks the other about something, and then the other player just doesn't really answer and is a bit non-committal, and then really disputes that action when it comes back to be important next turn, when it's too late for the other person to retract the action when they've had done with it. I've certainly also occasionally seen people using play by intent to try and do things that just aren't really possible in game. One example from a really long time back that I remember now was basically trying to get an entire unit's worth of armies all within 6-inch range of 2 different characters on the board. Something that might have been theoretically possible to do, but they just kept redeploying everything, both trying to shift all their units around so they could be in range of those 2 characters, and also stretch out to do things like screening and objectives as well, and spending quite a long time on the movement phase, and then when it got to the shooting phase and they were trying to use the benefits, lots of the units still wound up being something like 9 inches away from their characters, not even close to being within the aura range. I think it just doesn't really work for the whole social contract of playing by intent. If a whole load of things that you're asking your opponent if that's okay, the answer is a clear no, or stating that intent was to do one thing, maybe set up a unit so it's able to drop down and charge a certain units. Just because you've agreed to the intent of it might not necessarily mean that the unit can actually do it at all, if it just wasn't possible by the way that the miniatures were on the board. Finally, and something that can be a little bit dodgy with things like takebacks will be things like gaining a bit of information as to your opponent's intent or options, and perhaps changing their decision as to what their opponent's chosen to do, or maybe even a step further, how lucky they've been with dice rolls. I think for the most part, people might be a little bit reluctant to say allow people to use a defensive stratagem if they've just seen the dice rolls on an attack, and the opponents only then realise that their unit might be in serious danger and needs the protection. That maybe could be one example of a sequencing error where the opponent's gained a whole bunch of information if their opponent goes easy on them, basically allowing them not to use the defensive stratagem if the opponent had rolled super low, but only use it if they'd rolled super high. Quite a big advantage with not having to waste a command point unless you need to. Even before dice rolls are a thing though, it could be a big deal. Say for example a Chaos player might want to use their cultist to move on to an objective. Perhaps that's only a good idea if the enemy player doesn't choose to overwatch them. If they move on to the objective and the opponent declares overwatch and then they please playing by intent and saying that was a gotcha move and make the first player feel bad unless they allow a take back, they've essentially gained some information with that, in that they would have happily put their squad there if you hadn't chosen to overwatch and you were saving a command point for something, but now you've said that you were going to, they've decided not to. Having said all that, I certainly wouldn't go looking for malice where there's obviously none. There's going to be very few people out there who are deliberately going out and trying to fish for information like that, and it probably wouldn't even be the best idea in the first place, given that if the first player wasn't lenient on them, the unit would just have wound up in a bad situation. But it's certainly something that's crossed my mind when people try and change actions only when you've declared what you're doing in reaction to those actions. In any case though, looking forward to all your thoughts down in the comments. For the most part I would say that a lot of this is maybe slightly overthinking it. In general I personally find playing by intent just to be a much more relaxed form of a game and really focus on the actual tactics and strategy as opposed to gotchas or sequencing errors. I do find the kind of edge cases interesting though, and I'll certainly be interested to hear if you've had any experiences that fall into the more edge case type things like how polite you might be with gotchas like heroic intervention and Overwatch, or stated intention to hide units behind ruins, and all sorts of other similar things. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.